The room went quiet just long enough for the laughter to settle into something sharp. Diane lifted her glass with effortless grace, her smile perfectly timed, perfectly controlled. "Stop pretending to be a businesswoman, Noelle," she said, her voice smooth but loud enough to reach every corner of the table. "Your little brand isn't a real business." A few seconds passed, and then the laughter came. Soft at first, then easier, more comfortable. My mother covered her mouth, but her eyes were smiling. My father nodded as if Diane had simply said something obvious, something everyone had been thinking. I didn't react right away. I placed my fork down carefully, aligning it with the edge of my plate, buying myself a moment to breathe without letting it show. When I finally looked up, I met Diane's eyes. She was watching me, waiting for something. Defense, embarrassment, anything that would confirm her version of me. I gave her none of it. "Understood," I said quietly. The word landed softly, almost invisible compared to her voice, but it was enough. The conversation moved on instantly, shifting back to safer ground, leaving me behind like I had always been. But beneath the table, my fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of my dress. Because what no one in that room understood was this: Diane's company wasn't as stable as she believed, and I knew exactly why. Dinner continued like a script I had memorized years ago. Diane led every conversation, moving from one topic to another with practiced confidence. She spoke about Elin Vogue like it was inevitable, like success was something already secured rather than something still at risk. She mentioned an upcoming contract, something she described as transformational, the kind of deal that would push the company into an entirely new level. My father leaned forward, visibly impressed, asking questions not to understand but to admire. My mother added small comments of encouragement, reinforcing the same narrative they had built around her for years. Diane didn't need to prove anything in that room. She only needed to perform, and they would believe. I listened without interrupting, tracking the details she revealed without realizing it. She spoke about expansion, about new suppliers, about scaling production to meet anticipated demand. What she didn't mention was how those decisions were being financed, or how sustainable they actually were. The numbers behind her words didn't align with the confidence in her voice. They rarely did, but no one at the table was listening for that. They were listening for certainty, and Diane gave it to them. When she paused to take a sip of wine, my mother turned to me briefly, as if remembering I was still part of the conversation. "And you, Noelle?" she asked, her tone polite but detached. How is your project going?" The word project hung in the air, carefully chosen, small enough to keep expectations low. I nodded slightly. "It's stable," I said. That was all I offered. There was no follow-up question, no curiosity. My answer was enough to confirm what they already believed, that whatever I was doing existed somewhere below the level of importance. Diane smiled faintly, setting her glass down. "Stable is good," she said. "Not everyone is built for growth." The comment was light, almost casual, but it landed exactly where she intended it to. Another small ripple of laughter followed, quieter this time, more familiar. I didn't respond. There was nothing to gain from correcting her. Explaining would require them to listen, and they never had. As dessert was served, Diane returned to her upcoming deal, describing it in broader terms now, painting a picture of what it would mean for the company. She spoke about control, about influence, about becoming something larger than a brand. My father raised his glass again, toasting her future, his voice filled with certainty. I watched the moment carefully, not because it was new, but because it was predictable. They believed in her version of reality completely, without hesitation, without question. I noticed something else. She never mentioned risk. By the time dinner ended, the conversation had already moved past me entirely. My mother handed me a container of leftovers without really looking at me, a gesture that felt more like routine than care. Diane was on her phone, likely sharing another curated piece of her life with an audience that only saw what she chose to show. My father lingered at the table, still talking about the deal. still convinced it was the beginning of something permanent. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the noise of the house fading behind me as the door closed. For a moment I stood there, letting the quiet settle, feeling the difference between what they believed and what actually existed. Then I walked to my car. It wasn't impressive. It never had been. But it started when I turned the key, steady and reliable, unlike the narrative Diane had built around herself. I sat there for a few seconds, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, replaying her words in my mind. Not because they hurt. That part had faded a long time ago, but because they confirmed something important. She still didn't see me. I reached for my phone and unlocked it, opening a file I had been building for months. Financial statements, supplier contracts, payment timelines, every detail connected, every dependency mapped. Diane believed she was about to secure her company's future with one deal. What she didn't realize was that the structure she depended on was already shifting. And this time, I wasn't going to stay invisible. I didn't realize I was invisible until I understood that nothing I did ever changed the way they looked at me. It wasn't one moment or one sentence that made it clear. It was the pattern, the consistency of being overlooked, even when I tried to be seen. I remember standing in the living room when I was 12, holding a stack of printed pages I had worked on for days. I had taken my father's small business records and organized them into something clearer, something structured. I had found where he was losing money, where small changes could make a difference. I thought he would care. I thought he would at least look. He took the pages from me, skimmed the first one, and then set them aside without reading further. "That's nice, Noelle," he said, distracted, already thinking about something else. "But you don't need to worry about this." I stood there for a second longer than I should have, waiting for him to say something more, before quietly taking the pages back. A few minutes later, Diane walked in wearing a dress she had picked out for a school event. The reaction was immediate. My mother smiled, my father looked up, and suddenly the room felt different. "You look beautiful," my mother said, stepping closer to adjust the fabric as if it mattered. Diane laughed, spinning once, drawing attention without effort. The same room that had barely acknowledged me moments earlier now revolved entirely around her. I watched it happen, not with jealousy, but with something quieter: recognition. That was how things worked. Not based on effort, not based on substance, but on what people could see. As we grew older, the difference between us became clearer. Diane didn't just receive attention, she knew how to create it. She understood what people responded to, how to present herself, how to turn even small things into something worth celebrating. By high school, she had already built a reputation. Fashion shows, social events, connections that extended beyond the classroom. She didn't wait for opportunities. She made them visible. My parents followed that visibility, reinforcing it, investing in it, treating it like proof of something larger. I moved in a different direction, one that didn't require an audience. While Diane was building presence, I was building understanding. I spent my time analyzing systems, learning how things functioned beneath the surface. Numbers were consistent in a way people weren't. They didn't change based on perception. They didn't ignore you because you weren't interesting enough. They either made sense or they didn't, and when they didn't, there was always a reason. That clarity became something I relied on, something that didn't depend on whether anyone else paid attention. When Diane was accepted into a prestigious fashion program, the reaction at home was immediate and overwhelming. There were celebrations, conversations about her future that stretched for hours, plans being made as if success was already guaranteed. My parents spoke about her with certainty, as if she represented something they had always expected. I sat at the same table, listening, watching the way they framed her path as something exceptional. When it was my turn, I told them I had been accepted into a program focused on accounting and financial strategy. My father nodded, approving in a distant way. "That's practical," he said. "You'll always be able to find work." It wasn't meant to diminish anything, but it did. Diane was building something exciting. I was choosing something safe. That was how they saw it. The difference became more defined when Diane decided to launch Elon Vogue. By then, she had built enough visibility that her idea felt larger than it actually was. She presented it with confidence, framing it as an opportunity that just needed the right support to succeed. My parents didn't question it. They didn't ask for detailed plans or financial breakdowns. They believed in her, the same way they always had. Within a short time, they had committed a significant portion of their savings to help her start. I watched that decision carefully, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed something I had already understood. In our family, belief wasn't based on evidence. It was based on perception. When I approached them later with my own plan, the response was different. I explained what I wanted to do, how I intended to acquire a failing fashion brand and rebuild it from the inside. I had numbers, projections, a structure that made sense. My father listened, but I could see the hesitation before he spoke. "It sounds complicated," he said, "and risky." My mother added, "Maybe you should start with something smaller, something more stable." They weren't dismissing me out of cruelty. They just didn't see me the same way they saw Diane. To them, I wasn't someone who created something visible. I was someone who managed details. So I stopped trying to convince them. I took what I had and moved forward without their approval. I studied the industry more closely, not from the outside, but from within its structure. I looked at where companies failed, where they overspent, where they relied too heavily on appearance instead of foundation. I watched Elan Vogue grow through visibility, through attention, through momentum that didn't require stability to look convincing. At the same time, I started building something of my own. Not something they would notice, something they wouldn't understand until it was too late to ignore. I didn't announce the moment I bought the company, because there was nothing about it that looked like a success. The brand had been sitting quietly on the edge of failure for months, buried under unsold inventory, inconsistent production, and decisions that had been made without understanding the consequences. Most people saw a name that had already lost its value. I saw a system that had been mismanaged, not broken. That difference was enough. I used everything I had to secure it. Savings I had built over years, money my parents had never intended for me to risk, and a loan from my uncle that came with more concern than confidence. No one thought it would work. That part didn't bother me. I wasn't building something to prove them wrong. I was building something that made sense. The first weeks were quiet and unremarkable. There were no announcements, no rebranding campaigns, no attempt to attract attention. I focused on what was already there. I went through every line of cost, every supplier agreement, every product that had failed to move. The problems weren't complicated. They were ignored. Pricing that didn't match the market. Production timelines that weren't realistic. Inventory that had been created to look impressive instead of being useful. I removed what didn't work without hesitation. It wasn't about preserving what the brand had been. It was about rebuilding what it could become. At the same time, Diane's company was expanding in the opposite direction. Elan Vogue was everywhere. Campaigns, collaborations, events that positioned her brand as something aspirational. Every time I visited home, there was a new article, a new milestone, a new reason for my parents to talk about her with certainty. She had built something visible, something people could point to and admire. From the outside, it looked complete, but I had started to understand what sat underneath it. While she was increasing her presence, she was also increasing her costs. Marketing budgets that grew faster than revenue. Partnerships that looked strong but didn't generate consistent returns. A system that depended on maintaining the appearance of growth, even when the numbers didn't support it. It wasn't immediately obvious, but it was there, hidden in the gaps between what she said and what actually existed. My company didn't grow like that. It didn't need to. The changes I made were small at first, but they were consistent. I adjusted production to match actual demand. I worked with suppliers who could deliver reliability instead of volume. I brought in someone I trusted, a designer who understood that product had to exist beyond presentation. Together, we built something simple and functional. Pieces people could wear, not just photograph. Orders started returning slowly, then more consistently, not because of marketing, but because the product worked. Customers came back. That was something Diane's company couldn't rely on in the same way. Her growth depended on attention. Mine depended on structure. Once the foundation was stable, I shifted my focus outward. I started looking at the network around Elan Vogue, not the brand itself, but everything it depended on to function. Suppliers, logistics companies, distribution partners. I mapped the connections the same way I would map a financial system, identifying where control existed and where it didn't. Diane had built relationships, not ownership. She trusted availability without securing it. That was where the weakness was. I moved carefully. I didn't approach anything directly. Instead, I looked for companies that were already under pressure. A logistics firm struggling with delayed payments, a supplier operating on margins too thin to absorb risk. I offered stability where they needed it, restructuring agreements in ways that aligned with my interests. On the surface, nothing changed. They continued operating as they always had. But behind the structure, something shifted. They were no longer independent. They were connected to me. Each decision on its own looked small. A contract adjusted here, a stake acquired there, nothing that would draw attention. But together, they formed something Diane couldn't see. A system that surrounded her company without being visible from within it. By the end of the first year, my company was no longer unstable. By the end of the second, it was expanding into markets that didn't depend on image. Canada, the UK, Japan. Growth that was quiet but consistent, built on processes that could be repeated instead of moments that had to be recreated. Diane still believed I was working on something small. She still thought I spent my time behind a screen, managing details that didn't matter. She didn't understand that while she was building a brand people could see, I was building the structure her brand depended on. And structures don't need attention to hold power. They just need to exist in the right places. The first sign wasn't dramatic enough for anyone to notice. A shipment that arrived late by 3 days, explained away as a logistics delay. Then another, pushed back a week with a vague apology from the supplier. No one at the top level reacted. They didn't need to. From where Diane stood, these were minor disruptions, the kind that could be absorbed without consequence. But I wasn't looking at individual events. I was watching the pattern. Payment cycles began to stretch beyond their usual range. Vendors who had once prioritized Elan Vogue started requesting partial payments up front, something they had never done before. That meant trust was already weakening. Production timelines became inconsistent, not because of external pressure, but because internal commitments were no longer being met. Diane continued to present growth, but the system underneath her company was beginning to shift out of alignment. I tracked everything without interfering. Each delay, each adjustment, each small inconsistency was added to the structure I had already built in my files. It didn't take long before the trend became clear. The company wasn't expanding anymore. It was compensating, filling gaps with momentum instead of stability. At the same time, nothing in her public image reflected any of this. Diane appeared in another feature, her name placed alongside founders who had built companies on solid ground. My parents framed the article and placed it in the living room, adding it to the growing collection of proof that she was succeeding. At dinner, they talked about her expansion plans, her upcoming partnerships, the opportunities that seemed to follow her everywhere. There was no hesitation in their voices, no sense of doubt. To them, success was already confirmed. I listened without correcting them. Diane controlled the narrative perfectly. She spoke about traction, about brand visibility, about the way her company was positioned in the market. None of those things required immediate financial proof. They were ideas, projections, expectations. People believed them because they sounded right, because they fit the image she had created. Internally, the pressure increased. One of her senior hires, a CFO brought in to stabilize operations, began raising concerns. I knew this because the companies I had quietly positioned myself within provided fragments of information. Not full reports, not direct access, but enough to understand the direction things were moving. The CFO questioned the burn rate, the imbalance between spending and revenue, the lack of liquidity to sustain current operations. Diane dismissed it as cautious thinking, reframing it as resistance to growth. When he pushed further, she replaced him. That decision removed the only internal resistance she had. Without anyone challenging her assumptions, Diane expanded faster. She signed new agreements, increased production, committed to larger campaigns. Every move looked like confidence. In reality, it was acceleration without control. She was building momentum in a system that was already unstable. At home, nothing changed. My parents continued to speak about her as if the outcome was guaranteed. When I mentioned something small, a question about sustainability, it was dismissed almost immediately. "You're always too cautious," my mother said one evening. "That's why you don't see opportunities the way she does." My father added, "Diane understands risk. That's what makes her successful." I didn't argue. There was no point in explaining something they weren't trying to understand. I shifted my attention fully to preparation. The positions I had built around her company were no longer passive. They were points of influence. I reviewed supplier contracts more closely, identifying clauses that could be adjusted if needed. I strengthened my position within logistics, ensuring that decisions could be redirected at the right moment. Nothing changed on the surface. Everything changed underneath. The final signal came quietly. A payment that should have been automatic didn't process. Not delayed, not rescheduled, missed. That meant liquidity had dropped below a threshold Diane couldn't ignore, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. It meant the company had moved from managing growth to managing survival. She didn't say anything about it publicly. A few days later at dinner, she announced her upcoming deal with complete confidence, describing it as the moment everything would shift in her favor. My parents celebrated immediately, their relief visible, their belief unchanged. To them, this was confirmation that she had been right all along. I watched her carefully as she spoke. She believed it. That was the difference. She thought the deal would secure her company. She thought it would fix the gaps she hadn't acknowledged. She thought it would validate everything she had been building. She didn't realize that the system she was depending on had already changed. And when that deal moved forward, it wouldn't reinforce her control. It would reveal how little of it she actually had. By the time Diane believed she was negotiating the most important deal of her career, I had already mapped out every dependency that deal required to survive. It wasn't about branding or visibility anymore. It was about movement, timing, and control. Fashion looked effortless from the outside, but underneath, it depended on a chain of decisions that had to align perfectly. Diane had built her company without securing that chain. She relied on access, not ownership, on relationships, not structure. That was where I moved. I didn't approach it directly. That would have exposed too much too early. Instead, I expanded through the same method I had used from the beginning, quietly and without visibility. The logistics company handling most of Elon Vogue's distribution had been struggling under delayed payments and inconsistent scheduling. I acquired a controlling interest through a private investment entity, restructuring its operations in exchange for influence over priority contracts. To anyone watching, it looked like a company stabilizing itself. In reality, it had shifted its alignment. At the same time, I increased my stake in one of Diane's primary suppliers. They had been operating on margins too thin to absorb instability, and Diane's delayed payments had pushed them close to the edge. I offered capital with conditions, ensuring that future agreements would be structured differently. They accepted without hesitation. They needed stability. I provided it. None of these moves were visible on their own. Each one looked like a normal adjustment, a company securing funding, a supplier protecting itself. But together, they created something Diane couldn't see, a network that no longer answered solely to her, a system that could continue functioning independently of her decisions or stop responding to them entirely. There was a moment, brief but clear, when I considered ending everything quickly. I had the ability to disrupt her operations within days, delay shipments, adjust pricing, force renegotiations she couldn't meet. It would have been efficient, final. But that wasn't what I wanted. This wasn't about removing her. It was about forcing reality into a space where illusion had been allowed to grow unchecked. Diane moved forward with complete confidence. She announced internally that a major strategic partnership was close to being finalized, something she described as a turning point for the company. Her team responded the way they always did, with excitement layered over uncertainty. They trusted her because they had been given no reason not to. Even as operations became more unstable, the narrative she presented remained consistent. The contract she was preparing to sign depended on everything she no longer controlled: supply guarantees, delivery timelines, cost structures. All of it assumed stability that no longer existed under her authority. Through the investment structure I had created, I positioned myself as a key intermediary in that agreement. Not as an individual, not as someone she would recognize, but as a strategic partner offering reliability where her system had begun to fail. When the preliminary terms were drafted, I reviewed them carefully. Every clause served a purpose: performance thresholds tied to measurable outcomes, delivery obligations that required consistency, exit conditions that protected the investor if those standards weren't met. On the surface, it looked like support, the kind of deal founders waited for. In reality, it was a framework that would expose every weakness the moment pressure was applied. My legal advisor asked the question I had already considered. "If she signs this without understanding it," he said, "you'll control the direction of her company." I didn't answer immediately. Control wasn't something I had set out to take. It was something that formed naturally when structure replaced assumption. Diane had built something people could see. I had built something that functioned, and in the end, function determined outcome. I approved the terms. The offer was delivered through the same channels Diane trusted, presented as the opportunity she had been working toward. When she received it, her reaction was immediate: excitement, relief, validation. She saw it as confirmation that everything she had done was leading to this moment. At home, nothing changed. My parents spoke about the deal as if it had already succeeded. They talked about expansion, about influence, about what it would mean for the future. They looked at Diane with certainty, the same way they always had. When they looked at me, there was no difference. I was still the one working quietly, the one who understood numbers but didn't shape outcomes. I didn't correct them, because by the time the deal was signed, the outcome would no longer be something they could misunderstand. It would be something they would have to see. And when they did, the difference between what Diane believed she controlled and what actually existed would no longer be invisible. The deal was signed on a Tuesday morning, and by that evening Diane was already celebrating it like the future had been secured. She hosted a private event at the office, curated down to the smallest detail, the lighting soft, the music controlled, everything designed to reinforce the same image she had always projected. From the outside, it looked flawless. Inside, I could feel the tension beneath it, subtle but present, like something stretched too far without breaking yet. I hadn't planned to go, but Diane insisted earlier that day. "You should come," she said, her tone light but deliberate. "It might help you understand how real business works." The invitation wasn't about including me. It was about contrast. She wanted me there as a reminder of what she believed I wasn't. I accepted without hesitation. When I arrived, the room was already full. Conversations moved easily, driven by the energy of what people believed was a turning point. Diane stood at the center, composed and confident, her presence drawing attention without effort. People listened when she spoke, responded when she smiled, adjusted themselves around her as if she set the rhythm of the space. It was familiar. She had always known how to control perception. I stayed near the edge of the room, observing. From there, everything was clearer. The employees who were trying to believe in the future she described. The partners who were present because they needed her success to remain intact. The small pauses in conversations that hinted at uncertainty no one wanted to acknowledge. Nothing in the structure had changed. Only the story had. Halfway through the evening, Diane called for attention. She raised her glass and began speaking about growth, momentum, and what the deal meant for the company. Her words were precise, rehearsed without sounding rehearsed, designed to reinforce confidence. She described the partnership as validation, as proof that her vision had always been right. The room responded exactly as expected. Applause filling the space, the illusion strengthening with every second. Then she shifted her attention. "And I want to thank everyone who's been part of this journey," she said, scanning the room before her gaze settled on me. The pause was intentional. "Even those who prefer to stay behind the scenes." A few people turned, their attention following hers. She smiled slightly. "My sister Noelle is here tonight. She works with numbers, mostly. Spreadsheets, analysis. Important, I suppose, but not exactly what builds something like this." A few people laughed, unsure but willing. Diane stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel personal while still being heard. "I've always told her," she continued, "if you're going to be in business, you have to actually build something people can see, not just sit behind a screen and pretend it matters." Her eyes met mine directly. "Stop pretending to be a businesswoman, Noelle. This is what it looks like." The room went still. It wasn't just the words. It was the certainty behind them. The assumption that she understood exactly who I was and where I belonged. The assumption that no one in that room would question it. I held her gaze without reacting. For a moment, the familiar instinct surfaced, to let it pass, to remain in the role she had defined for me. That would have been easier. It always had been. But something had shifted long before that night, and now it settled into place with clarity I couldn't ignore. She wasn't just dismissing me, she was defining me, and doing it in a room where that definition would be accepted without hesitation. I set my glass down slowly, the sound barely noticeable against the silence. "You're right," I said, my voice even, almost quiet enough to disappear. "I should stop pretending." She smiled, satisfied, already turning away, assuming the moment had ended. It hadn't. I left without drawing attention, moving through the room as conversations slowly resumed behind me. The hallway outside was empty, the noise fading as the door closed. For a few seconds I stood there, letting the silence settle. Then I reached for my phone. I opened the message thread with my legal team and typed a single instruction: "Initiate review. Prepare for board intervention." The response came quickly. Everything was in place. All it required was confirmation. I sent it. By the time Diane finished celebrating that night, the process had already begun. Contracts would be reviewed, clauses would be enforced. Authority would shift through structures she had agreed to without fully understanding. She believed the deal had secured her position. What it had actually done was give me the leverage to redefine it. And this time, I wasn't staying invisible. The emergency board meeting was set for Friday at 10, and for the first time since Diane launched Elon Vogue, she walked into a room she didn't fully control. I arrived early, not because I needed to, but because timing mattered. The reception area was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that follows uncertainty. Employees moved with purpose but avoided lingering, their conversations cut short the moment someone new entered the space. The energy had shifted. Not visibly enough for an outsider to notice, but enough for anyone paying attention. I didn't stop at the front desk. The boardroom doors were already closed when I reached them, voices rising and falling behind the glass. Diane's voice was sharp, controlled but strained, pushing for clarity she hadn't been given yet. She was used to setting the tone, to entering a room with authority already established. Today, she was trying to regain it. I pushed the door open. The conversation stopped immediately. Diane turned first, irritation appearing before recognition. "Noelle?" she said, her voice carrying disbelief more than surprise. "What are you doing here? This is a board meeting." The implication was clear. I didn't belong in that space, not in that moment, not at that level. I didn't answer her question. I walked forward instead, moving past the side of the table to the far end where the representatives of the strategic partner were seated. They stood as I approached, a small but deliberate shift in posture that changed the room without a word being spoken. "We requested Ms. Parker's presence," one of them said calmly. Diane frowned, confusion tightening into something sharper. "Why?" she asked. "What does she have to do with any of this?" I took the seat at the head of the table. The movement was quiet, controlled, but it altered everything. Chairs adjusted, eyes shifted. The balance that had once centered around Diane moved, not dramatically but undeniably. "This meeting," I said, my voice even, "is to review operational compliance under the agreement signed earlier this week." "I know what the meeting is about," Diane replied, her tone sharper now. "I'm asking why you're involved." "Because the agreement you signed places control of key operational areas in the hands of the strategic partner." "I'm aware of that," she said, crossing her arms. "We negotiated those terms." "You acknowledged them," I said. "You didn't understand them." A few people around the table exchanged glances. Diane's expression hardened. "Then explain it," she said, "since you seem so confident." I nodded once, then turned slightly toward the legal representative beside me. "Begin with the supply chain." He opened a folder, speaking with measured clarity. "Under the current structure, primary sourcing, manufacturing logistics, and distribution operations are managed through entities connected to the Strategic Investment Group." Diane exhaled, impatient. "Yes, that's part of the integration. What you were not made aware of," he continued, "is the ownership alignment within those entities." The room stilled. I leaned forward slightly, meeting her eyes. "The logistics network responsible for over half of your distribution," I said, "is controlled by a holding structure I own." For a moment, nothing changed. Then it did. "That's not possible," she said, her voice tight. "We vetted every partner." "You vetted performance," I replied. "Not ownership," the legal representative continued. "Additionally, the primary supplier supporting your current production cycle operates under revised terms tied to the same controlling structure." Diane shook her head once, sharply. "No, that's not how this works." "It is now," I said. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It moved through her expression slowly, replacing certainty with something less stable. She looked around the table, searching for resistance, for contradiction, for anything that would disrupt what she was hearing. There was nothing. "You're saying these companies answer to you?" she asked, her voice lower now. "I'm saying the systems your company depends on are no longer independent of me." The difference mattered. She looked back at me, and for the first time, she wasn't seeing me as the person she had dismissed. She was seeing the position I held. "You don't have that kind of authority," she said, but the conviction was gone. "This is my company." "It's your brand," I said, "not your infrastructure." I let the silence settle before continuing. "And under the agreement you signed, control over that infrastructure determines operational authority." No one spoke. No one needed to. Diane's composure didn't collapse dramatically. It shifted, just enough to expose what had always been underneath it. Confidence built on assumption, not structure. Control based on perception, not ownership. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Long enough," I said. The room remained still, but everything had already changed. Not through confrontation, not through force, but through structure that had been built long before this moment. She thought this meeting would stabilize her company. It didn't. It showed her who had been holding it together all along. The silence didn't break when the meeting ended. It shifted slowly, like something settling into place after being forced to move. No one rushed to speak. No one tried to argue. The structure had already been defined, and there was nothing left to negotiate. Diane stood at the far side of the table, her posture still, her expression no longer shaped for an audience. For the first time, she wasn't performing. She was processing. I didn't raise my voice. There was no need to. "Here's what happens next," I said, keeping everything anchored in clarity. "The company continues operating. Existing contracts remain in place. Production and distribution will not be disrupted." A few people shifted slightly, relief replacing tension. Stability mattered more than anything else in that room. But decision-making changes. Diane's eyes met mine, guarded now, searching for something she could still control. "You're removing me," she said, not as a question, but as an expectation. "No," I replied. "I'm repositioning you." That was the moment the room adjusted again. "You built the image," I continued. "You understand how to present, how to create direction, how to connect with an audience. That has value, but you were making decisions in areas you didn't understand, and that's what put everything at risk." I paused just long enough for the distinction to land. From this point forward, financial control, operational strategy, and contract authority are no longer yours. No one interrupted. "You remain with the company," I added. "As creative director, you focus on design, product, and brand identity. The rest will be handled by people who know how to manage it." For a moment, Diane didn't respond. The idea of staying without control didn't fit the version of leadership she had built around herself. To her, authority had always meant visibility, recognition, influence. Now it meant limitation, structure, accountability. "And if I don't accept that?" she asked quietly. I held her gaze. "Then the system you depend on stops supporting you." There was no tension in my voice, no emphasis, just the reality of what already existed. She looked down at the table, her hand resting against the surface as if grounding herself. Around us, no one moved. The decision no longer belonged to the room. It belonged to her. After a long moment, she nodded. It wasn't agreement. It was acceptance. The meeting ended without ceremony. Papers were gathered, chairs moved back, conversations resumed in low voices. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It was no longer uncertainty. It was adjustment, a system realigning itself to something it could sustain. I stood last. When I walked out of the boardroom, I didn't look back. There was nothing left in that space that needed my attention. Everything that mattered had already shifted. The weeks that followed weren't dramatic. There were no headlines, no visible collapse or sudden transformation, but internally, everything changed. Costs were reduced, contracts were rewritten, processes that had been ignored were rebuilt with precision. The company stabilized, not because of a single decision, but because the structure finally matched reality. Diane changed more slowly. At first, she resisted in small ways, testing limits that no longer existed, pushing against decisions she no longer controlled. But over time, something shifted. Without the weight of pretending to manage everything, she focused on what she actually understood: design, direction. Creating something people responded to beyond appearance. For the first time, her work had substance behind it. At home, the silence between us felt different. My parents no longer spoke with certainty about things they didn't understand. They asked questions instead. They listened. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to change the way the room felt. The dynamic didn't reset. It couldn't. But it moved. One evening, I stayed late at the office reviewing reports. As I walked past the design area, I noticed a single light still on. Diane was there, sitting at a desk, surrounded by fabric samples and sketches. She looked up when she heard me. "I didn't know it was this much work," she said quietly. "It always was," I replied. She nodded, looking back down, not arguing, not deflecting, just acknowledging. I left without saying anything else. Outside, the air felt clear, not because anything around me had changed, but because I no longer needed it to. For years, I had measured myself against how they saw me, how they defined success, how they decided what mattered. Now none of that held weight. What I built didn't depend on their recognition. It never had. I got into my car, the same one they had always overlooked, and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. Success doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need approval. It doesn't need to be seen to exist. It just needs to be real. If you've ever been in a room where people decided who you were before you had the chance to show them otherwise, you already understand this story. And if you've ever chosen to build something quietly instead of proving yourself out loud, then you know exactly why it matters. So tell me, what would you have done in that moment? Stayed silent or taken control when it mattered most? And if this story stayed with you even a little, stay here. There are more stories like this waiting, and you won't want to miss what comes next. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.